There we go.
Sounds like you choked on that one.
All right. A class is a blueprint or recipe. Thanks. For an object. In Java, an object can be a real world or imaginary thing. So examples, a book, a student, a frog. Well, these are things we've done before. We've created these things. Like I gave you the frog class a couple months ago. Objects have attributes, variables, and behavior, methods. You create objects using the new keyword. All right. So that's just a little intro. We've kind of covered this a long time ago, back in, say, September a little bit. So hopefully it seems not too scary. When thinking of classes versus objects, consider an apple pie recipe. One recipe, class, can be used to make hundreds of pies, objects. The pies are the objects, the recipe is the class. A class is declared like this. Public class rectangle. Like we've had a lot of classes that were named for the day of the class, the day of our course. So like day 35, it says public class day 35, and the file that it's in is named day 35. And you can also do this without the word public. When you use public, the file name has to be the same as the class name plus .java. But if you take off the public, then the file name can be something different.
Now, why would you want to take out the public? Does it make it different?
It's a good question. We're going to see that actually today, because for today's assignment, I'm having you make a person class, but I wanted the file to be called day 35. So there's actually going to be two classes in there. One is day 35, and the file's named that, and that's a public class. But down below it just says class person, and that can exist in the same file, because I just wanted one file to grade. I didn't want to try to have you have two files to worry about. We'll get to that point, but for right now, we don't really need to have two files to worry about. It'll all just be in one file. I think in general, you would just be saying public class for almost everything you would do. Yes?
Is there such thing as a private class?
Wow. Is there a private class? Yeah, I don't know. Probably. Nick, do you know? It can only exist in itself, and no one can ever talk to it. So then my head explodes. I don't know.
Packages, I think, and it can only be accessed by its own package. But
yeah. So we wouldn't. You don't have to worry about making a private. Okay. So, wow. We're going to go right here. Inside a class, at the top, we declare our variables. And you always make them private for what we're doing. Yes?
So this is inside the brackets you had, right?
This would be inside that rectangle one. I'm just showing you the pieces as we go along. So always make your variables private. when they're at the top of the class. Not in all your methods and things, but at the top of the class, you're declaring variables, make them private. Okay, so the next, a class typically has one or more constructors. Constructors are used to initialize the values of the variables. So imagine if you were trying to create a rectangle object, you need a way to say, hey, I want a rectangle that's 30 units wide and 20 units tall. So, you would make a constructor that accepted two values as parameters. I'll give you an example. So here's a perfectly valid constructor, public rectangle, int w, int h, and then inside I say, hey, that class variable we created called width, I want to put w in there, and I want to put this h into the height. And that's, a constructor doesn't have to do, it has to do whatever it has to do given your object. But in this case, not too much. A constructor always has the same name as the class. And it never has a return type. So notice it doesn't say public void rectangle or public int rectangle. It just says public rectangle. That's how you know it's a constructor. And it has the exact same name as the class. Questions? Yes?
If you have more than one constructor, they're probably not all the same name though.
They all, so Johannes asked if we have more than one constructor, how does that work? They would all be public rectangle, but they would have to have a different set of arguments, of parameters. So you couldn't do another one that had an int w and an int h. You could do, like, if one of them was a double, or, if you had a different arrangement, or if the rectangle had a name, like this is my favorite rectangle, or, But you couldn't do another one that had int w, int h, or int a, int b, because, it uses the signature here to decide if it's okay to overload. Yeah?
Wait, so the constructor part is the in W and H part?
This is a constructor. That whole thing. Charlotte?
So you could have one that was like double rectangle, int A and int B alongside.
No, anything that had an int and an int, you can't do. We've already done that. It would go to this one. You could have, let's think up one. You could have one that just had one int, and that would be a square. So you could say, hey, I'm still calling it a rectangle because, a square is a special kind of rectangle. So you could say, well, there's another public rectangle that just takes one int and it makes a square. So then it would internally set both the width and the height to the same value. So that would be allowed. And you could even have a rectangle that had nothing in the parentheses, because you could say, hey, if I don't tell you how big it is, I want it to be a 1 by 1 rectangle, whatever. You could have a default rectangle. These are good questions.
That's overloading the methods.
Yeah. This is when you have. Let's. I could just show you. We'll put another one there just so since it came up. I'm just going to say int x here, and we could easily have a second constructor that takes one number and sets both the width and the height to that same number, and. Well, Java figures out by how many variables you put in the parentheses which one to call.
Your attention, please. Initiate lockdown procedure.
Oh, I forgot. We're doing a
Stand by
lockdown.
for further instructions. Again, initiate lockdown procedure.